Hi, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming today and spending your time with us for the next hour. We appreciate you being here to hear about the story of around Discover and how they've tackled some of their data on AWS. So Arun and Michael, tell us why we're here today.
Thanks for being here again. And one of the key things that we did a survey recently about a few months ago, and one of the findings in that was 84% of C-suite executives. There's about a survey for 1,500 executives all around the world, and 84% said that they realize AI and data is critical for their competitive advantage. But the other figure, which is very alarming, is about 76% of them also said that they struggle to scale it. And that's where I think the journey that we went through at Discover becomes so important, that we were able to take something, not just in an experimental mode, but also actually scale it beyond that. And that's, Michael, if you want to talk about it.
Yeah, so again, thanks everyone for coming, and thank you, Accenture, for allowing me to speak as part of this. We really appreciate it. So ultimately, and we'll talk a lot around how we at Discover manage data and what we do with it. But I think particularly in financial services, but really across most industries right now, data is a potential source of competitive advantage, and it really depends on how you imagine it and how you govern it and how you use it. And so I think what we'll talk about is sort of the ways that we've approached it at Discover. I think you have a lot of options on how to do it. We'll talk about some of the choices that we made and why, and then potentially talk about some of the things that we decided not to do and why. But I think as you see, and maybe if we sort of go to the next slide, it's what's really important organizationally is that there is a business buy-in. And from a top-down perspective, I think at Discover, we're really fortunate that our CEO, Roger Hochschild, has a really intense focus on data and the ability for data to be a source of competitive advantage.
Okay, well, thank you again for being here today to tell the story of Discover. As banks start to realize that traditional distribution-led growth formulas are no longer working, and some would even say loyalty has started to wane a bit, right? In banks, people are starting to move around. They want to be able to be more digital. They want to be able to open accounts online, apply for loans, and get approved online. Those types of things. Arun, in your role at Accenture, do you see consistent adoption of digital banking? And how does data visualization and visualization play into that?
So we do see a great uptake in terms of people trying to do all these digital initiatives and trying to enable the cool, sexy part of digital capabilities. There is a uptake on how to use data better that we see. One of the challenges that we see working with many customers is people are lost in doing POCs and proof of technologies, right? I think the challenge becomes when you try to make it industrialized and try to use it in actual business applications. And one of the key findings that we see is typically companies who are able to pivot and make it industrialized have about 3 times the return on investment than people who are just investing in proof of concept, proof of technologies, trying to validate the technology. Because Michael and I were just talking about, as we were walking over to the stage, the technology works, right? It's about how do you find that business case, and I think that's what, in Discover, we had the opportunity to look at it from the business lens.
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of pressures I think organizations have right now. You can see that we talk about on the slide. So we talk about regulatory, economic. It's really easy for companies to get defensive and to manage to compliance, to manage to regulations. And one of the things that we've been really fortunate with at Discover, and Discover for decades now has been a phenomenally successful brand. And so it takes a lot of fortitude and a lot of focus when times are going well to do things differently. So we had some use cases where we needed additional compute, and so those types of use cases were pretty straightforward. We wanted to move the data to the cloud and take advantage of the capabilities there. But for the rest of our data, it really, I think, took a lot of organizational imagination, not just technology, but from a business perspective to say, we believe we can get more out of our data, out of our infrastructure by this cloud journey, as opposed to just sort of staying where we were. So I think that sort of ultimate view of we can sort of wrangle more value out of our data by taking on this transformation and moving our data to the cloud, I think is fundamental to the starting point for for successful transformation.
And I think that was a key part in kind of putting the customer at the center of everything and trying to drive the whole customer centricity by looking at data and driving value through it.
Right, and that's definitely a differentiator when you think about the marketplace today, especially in financial services. Putting the customer, in the middle is going to help you grow in terms of customer acquisition, in terms of loyalty and things like that, right? So I think that's one of the big keys that I've seen just from working with you guys and seeing how you're tackling that. And your journey's been very interesting from the beginning, right? And the way you've kind of approached it. You talked about the MVPs and how you want to kind of move away from that, but really do things that are going to be in production, going to drive you to your end goal, and really put the where the rubber meets the road kind of thing. So let's talk about a little bit of the detail here, and maybe some of the opportunities for Discover and how you approach this. What did you do and how did you do it, and what were the meaningful pieces?
Yeah, so just maybe a little bit about Discover. Hopefully, I guess everyone in here is a Discover credit card holder, I assume. But we have three primary lines of business. Certainly our Discover card. We are a direct bank as well, so fairly sizable, maybe our best kept secret. We have over $50 billion in deposits in our direct bank. And our payment network, so we run certainly the Discover network, but also sort of Diners Club internationally and a number of sort of net-to-net partnerships internationally with a number of local payment networks across the globe. And so what we wanted to do as part of this journey was to create sort of a flywheel. So as Jim Collins talks about in Good to Great, creating a flywheel where your benefits compound on each other. So what we wanted to do was create the end user experience, I think, Chad, like you were talking about, that leads to more customers. And sort of as more customers come in, the more data you can collect, and the more you can understand about customer behavior and the better you can analyze them. That will then enable you to create a better experience. And the idea is to create that pinwheel that starts somewhat slowly and then sort of compounds on itself and gets better and better and better. The ultimate key, I think, is that certainly there is a lot of data that we have to consume, but it's what you do with it. It's how you analyze it, how you leverage it to create that pinwheel, and then how you actually drive it out to your individual channels. So back to the things like personalization, new product development, managing of people through their credit cycles, I think is another area where we spend a lot of time and I think seen a lot of success. So the opportunities, I think, are fairly significant, but this is how we viewed the business case and really our aspiration for being able to use the data through that process.
So talking about business case, Michael, when we started this journey, right, you had a lot of data and on-premise. What really was that push, or what really was that business case to start looking at a cloud journey?
So the first one was we have a lot of data that feeds our models, and we have a regulation called CECL that is going into effect at the end of this year. And so we had a lot of data that we had to consume, particularly as we created these models. We had to look back through the cycle, and given the economic cycle where it is, looking back to the turn of the cycle is a number of years in a number of years of history. And so the ability to consume that much data that quickly and to create new models, to be able to create that type of infrastructure on-prem would have just been untenable. And so we really, the cloud was the only way, AWS was the only way for us to really be able to get all the data in one place, to be able to create new models out of that data and eventually sort of create the production environment to run those models. So that was our first primary use case to get onto the cloud, and then seeing the benefits and really knowing that is our ultimate target. We've sort of backfilled the rest of the process on moving and we'll talk in a minute about sort of how we're moving our legacy environments onto the cloud in sort of what I hope is a methodical way.
Absolutely.
And this is not just a technology-driven program, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. So ultimately, I think sort of Arun had mentioned it, but the technologies are all there. You can use them more responsibly, you can use them less responsibly, but the technologies exist to run all of your data and all of your processes in the cloud. Ultimately, I think if this becomes a technology-driven transformation or a technology-driven venture, you've already lost the game, because you'll end up chasing the business cases, and there are very few businesses, I think, that are very interested in moving a like-for-like set of processes just to move to the cloud. I think there are some rationale to do that. Certainly the amount of compute, the ability to manage storage better, the ability to attract talent, right? That's where ultimately most of your engineering talent wants to be working. So there is value to it, but ultimately, until your business buys in and says, this is where we want to see our business, our use cases, and we can see value coming out of it, I think you have an uphill battle.
Good. And while you're all out there opening your account on the Discover website on your mobile phone, let's talk a little bit about how you got from your vision and plan into actual execution a little bit.
Yeah, certainly. And so just to level set as well before we dive into the details. So the journey, the transformation is by no means complete. We've learned a lot of lessons, and I think do some things really well. But we are constantly learning, constantly growing, and we are still relatively young in the journey. So I think for folks that look and start to see a lot of the PowerPoints and sophisticated architectures and sort of the things that look particularly advanced, I would say that the vast majority of organizations are still getting their feet wet. So you're not behind. I think depending on the industry and how you create a sense of urgency to start your transformations. But it's still early days in how to really use these environments most effectively. But I'll talk about sort of how we approach the key areas for our transformation. The first one, which I think is a really underappreciated part of this, but it is fundamentally important, is around data management and data governance. So we have a decades-old legacy environment, and as we've looked into a number of sort of our detailed calculations and models, and we have a really, really complex environment. And so one of the things that we decided as we started our transformation journey was that we wanted to reinvigorate the way we think about metadata management, data governance, lineage, things like that, because ultimately we didn't want to recreate the same complexity that we had in the cloud that we have on-prem. So creating a really strong, important, well-supported data governance process is really fundamental to the journey. We have hundreds of data engineers as well, all of whom have been working in our legacy environments for a long time. And so there's a measure of training, getting people sort of ready and engaged and excited about the cloud journey, but also understanding that it's going to take time and that some people will work in sort of cloud environments and some people will continue to maintain. And so really getting the our talent, our engineers, ready for the journey, I think was a fundamental part of it.
A big piece of getting everybody won over to actually go do this work, right? I mean, in terms of the culture change and people's jobs from day to day may change as this progresses, right?
Certainly, yeah. So there's a lot of change management that's required as part of it, and also so we run, we have a relatively large legacy environment. We run about 40,000 ab initio jobs a day. So we have a production operations team that spends a lot of time sort of managing our current operations. And as we move to the cloud, now you've added yet another environment for them to manage. And so we'll talk about how you manage with a sense of urgency to get to the cloud, because maintaining multiple production environments is not the easiest thing in the world. But that's all part of it, is how you not just create the technology to be able to manage your data in the cloud, but to manage enterprise operations as part of that, I think is a task as well.
I think that is something that stands out to me when I look at this slide, that it was a multidisciplinary team in the true sense. I mean, you had people looking at it from operations perspective, you had people looking at it from program portfolio management perspective, you had people looking at it from core technology, cloud data platform perspective, and all working together and aligning to that vision that you said up front, Roger laying down that data analytics is at the core of driving that business competitive advantage.
Right. Yeah. And so I think as we continue to sort of move down the chart, if you look at, so we have an enterprise data or enterprise decisioning platform. So we feed data and make a lot of decisions off of that data, both from a model training, model development perspective, but also an ongoing production execution perspective. So moving the decisioning platform along with the data, I think, is a significant amount of engineering effort as well. The cloud data platform, which I think is what most people would associate with, how you move to the cloud, is how do you create the products and all of the infrastructure, the data lake, the data warehouse, how you ingest the data, all of the what we'll call in a minute our cloud data fabric, creating all of the tools, products, and infrastructure on the cloud to be able to manage the data well.
So it was a true transformation. It wasn't moving, your 40,000 ab initio jobs today to AWS. It was transformation, right?
Well, it's a whole new set of products. We have a lot of homegrown tools that exist in our legacy environment. We have a number of tools that are wonderful and fit for purpose for what they're doing now, but don't necessarily translate to some of the use cases that we have, that we anticipate going forward. And so we're really trying to future-proof and create optionality as we build out our cloud platforms. And then the last part, which I think we've mentioned a little bit before, so we really needed a way to make sure that we were assessing the use cases for how we move data to the cloud and prioritizing that work appropriately. As we think about moving to the cloud, we need a process to disposition our existing assets. So do you retire? Do you rewrite? Do you refactor? Are you re-architecting what you're doing? And how do you get the business bought in? Are there areas where you want to redesign your business processes? And because again, without that business support and the prioritization from a business perspective, the process just wouldn't work. So this is how we sort of framed up our, the transformation initiative.
I think the last one, again, was very critical, right? Looking at it from a business perspective and thinking about how do you manage the demand and supply of the data assets that are being requested? How do you prioritize it? And how do you decide, okay, there's a good one to do, but not now, right? That's a tough decision.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Good. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about your decision to move to cloud and what were some of the factors behind that. I think you mentioned a few already, but if we can kind of hit on that before we move into more of the details a little bit.
Yeah. So ultimately, I think the business case of the cloud is relatively consistent. I think to whether it's data or your source systems and applications, but ultimately the ability to work with speed and work with agility. Mm-hmm. As long as you have the appropriate controls, the appropriate processes in place to be able to spin up environments really quickly, to scale them out, to be able to run auto scale, to not have to get into your multi-quarter procurement processes to add new hardware and to rack and wire new infrastructure in the data center, I think is all fundamental to the business case around moving to the cloud. I think on the flip side, there are risks, you could call them, I guess, or considerations, constraints. So everyone's heard about the number of the data breaches, and there's a significant amount of oversight and focus on how you move applications and how you move data to the cloud. And so really making sure that first of all, that you have organizational alignment on what you're doing, but also that you've built out appropriate risks and controls and processes so that you're responsibly managing the process and managing the data, I think, are fundamental.
I think one of the things that when we worked together, one of the things that we did was the whole AWS well-architected review, to kind of, which is a tool that Amazon and Accenture we have developed together. What we do is look at the maturity, the readiness of the organization to actually go on to the AWS journey, as well as if somebody is already on the platform, looking at how mature or how well designed that is. Right. And that was a study that we did with Discover to kind of find out, okay, what are the things that have been done well? What are the things that we need to do a little bit more? And it kind of looks at 45 plus question areas and finding out from operations perspective, security perspective, resilience perspective, looking at it from every aspect and saying, okay, are you ready to move these things to cloud? How mature it is, and where do you want to go?
And I know that can be done very quickly.
Yes.
How did it help in the journey? Did it show you any areas, any gaps that you needed to focus on?
As I said, we did that whole exercise for about a couple of weeks, and we identified about 12 key areas where we identified that there will be more effort needed to kind of harden the environment and move it to a stage where it's production ready.
Okay, great. Let's talk a little bit more detail here around your overall migration. Do you want to kind of dive in?
Yeah, so I'll talk about how we kicked off the process, and I'll sort of leave the Cecil part of what you talked about to the side for a second. But from a Discover perspective, we're really fortunate. We have the sort of size and scale to make it possible, but also I think necessary to work with folks like Accenture and a number of other key partners to be able to assess our environments and to really take a good look at what it would take to move to the cloud and to perform transformation in a responsible way. And so we have a significant number of assets. You can see petabytes of data. Just in Teradata, you see the 6,000 production tables. Those are, we have an on-prem Teradata that has 6,000 user-facing tables. There are a number of other sort of back office related tables. We also have a very significant SaaS grid with a number of production applications running off of those, a whole set of production processes and controls that have built up over time, all of which that we had to review and analyze as part of the cloud migration process. In addition to looking at our workforce and saying, was it appropriate? Can we manage and go through the change management process to get to the cloud, to have the right people in place? We've traditionally had a very high reliance on contractors and third-party resources, and as part of this process, we've made the decision to start to insource a number of those roles, and so that became part of part of our internal transformation as well.
And did you see when you did that it was easier to attract new talent? I know the talent market is tight, but did that help in terms of how you recruited and how you were able to add to your talent in your workforce?
Yeah, so I think it was a bit of the sort of the negative the other way. I think as we sort of talk about you're going to work in a legacy ab initio environment on Teradata for the next X number of years, I think you start to see the glimmer in folks' eyes sort of wane a little bit and not get quite as excited. So I think there's a little bit of the labor market is tight and there are other considerations beyond the technologies you work on, but most of your sort of most engineers want to feel like they're progressing.
Culture.
Right. And so I think one of the things that we've done as part of that, part of the benefit of having such a heavy third-party workforce is we can start to gear them more towards our legacy environments and have our associates work more on our newer environments and really build their skills and feel like they're growing as part of their careers as well.
That's great. Everyone, do you have anything?
No, I think Michael covered it.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about some of the frameworks you use, the 3CM framework. Can you guys elaborate on that a little bit? Yeah,
so I think one of the things that this is one of the assets, I guess, that Accenture brought as part of our engagement with them. I think it's handy to have a bit of a branding around it, a bit of sort of pithiness around how you describe our cloud data framework and how we think about the 3CM, et cetera. Ultimately, I think the verbs are relatively straightforward. You have to be able to capture your data, you have to transform it or curate it, you have to consume it somehow, and ultimately you have to manage it well. I think the benefit of bringing in a framework that has been sort of proven and used in a number of other areas is that's one less thing that you really have to sort of create yourself. Mm-hmm. And so, I think we've been really fortunate to have the benefit of working with you guys and working with some of our other strategic partners to really put together not only a framework, I think, but also a set of architecture and design patterns that enable us to really dive into our cloud migration without having to sort of start from scratch and learn every lesson on our own.
And Arun, how was it beneficial to the engagement?
Yeah, I think Mike kind of touched on it. We were not maintaining or doing any work on the legacy data side at Discover when we started this, right? So coming in from a strategy consulting perspective and looking at it, we needed a very structured approach of looking at it and applying some of the patterns that we have successfully used elsewhere. How can we translate that and make it relevant and tailor it to Discover? So this framework basically allowed us to take the Discover problem set, problem definition, and apply our design patterns to it in terms of defining how we can move from stage A to stage B, and look at every individual area in detail, but at the same time look at it from a holistic perspective as well.
Right, and it's helpful, I think, also to be able to contextualize the journey for folks that aren't necessarily as familiar with it. So, to look at things like data management, how you protect the data, how you govern the data, at the same level of importance as building out a data lake or building out your data warehouse or your event streaming patterns, I think is a really helpful way to make sure that all of these things, all of the gears are meshed. Because when one breaks down, the whole process breaks down. So really making sure that you have that holistic view of how to use these things, I think is critical to the process.
The other thing that I would mention is this also became kind of the communication framework. We did a lot of the lunch and learn awareness sessions at Discover when we were going into the cloud, the initial part of the journey. And I think this became a common vocabulary that everybody could relate to from the IT, from the business side. Very simple terms people can understand and relate to when they're talking about the overall cloud journey.
And where would you say in looking at this was the most challenging piece for you guys in terms of what needed to be done, the amount of work, the effort, or the risks involved?
But it's all a challenge.
I know you have a lot of different data sources.
Some of them I think are maybe a little bit underrated. I think as we think about data management and data governance, and it really requires our business partners to do things differently than they've done in the past. Really thinking about metadata, the definition of what we're using and how we're using it is a really heavy lift and a really fundamental part of what we're doing. Being able to create data pipelines that are secure, that are scalable. Again, the technology all exists, but getting it in place, being able to consume appropriately out of, in some cases, legacy systems that are decades old. Are
mainframes even, right?
Right, exactly, are a challenge as well. So really, I think it's they maybe happen in differing orders depending on how your legacy environment works and what your sort of business is, but ultimately, they are all a challenge, and I wouldn't underestimate any of them because, again, if they don't all work in concert, then the whole system breaks down.
Okay.
I absolutely agree with Michael. I think I would just kind of double down on the operational aspect of it, and that's where Michael's role comes in as the head of operations for data and analytics. I think just not thinking about the technology part of it, but thinking about how do you operationalize it? How do you think about that metadata, that governance, and how do you make it production ready? It was a bigger challenge than any of the technologies, I would say.
Yeah, and we'll talk, in a minute or two, I guess, about some of the detailed technologies. I think, being where we are, and it probably may have been a bit of a surprise to some folks in the audience that we really haven't talked about much of the detailed technology as we get into it. But ultimately, the hardest part, that at least from my perspective, that we found in this journey has been the non-technology parts. Certainly a lot of challenge in creating really strong pipelines and tools that let you move data appropriately, and you can create the appropriate data validation and all of those types of processes are critical and important and not easy to do. But changing people, changing thoughts around it, I think is really the significantly heavy lift.
Okay, good. Thank you for sharing that. And yes, we are at reInvent. We're going to talk a little bit now. Let's talk about some of the architectural elements of AWS that helped you power this.
Sure. So the technologies change over time for sure, but at the sort of most foundational, if you think about, we have a variety of different legacy systems, and we consume the raw data, move that data into an S3 data lake. We run a number of predominantly ab initio, but also Spark, PySpark type of jobs against them as well. We've created, along with some of our partners, a universal data loader which takes the data when it's sort of load ready and moves it into the right place. So we standardize the data on Avro format and move that data into Snowflake, which is our primary data warehouse environment, and then run a number of different tools against it. Our Elation is our data catalog. We also run all of this on an OpenShift platform. I think one of the things that we decided as an organization is that while we are sort of putting a big bet on AWS, we also wanted to be somewhat cloud agnostic or have some optionality long term. So we've created, or we're running on top of the OpenShift platform for a number of our workloads.
I think the only thing I would mention here is we had very deep and active involvement of our Accenture AWS business group in this area, where we actually had architects who are certified on AWS come in and do a lot of the designs and do a lot of the recommendations from the services perspective, which services to use and so on and so forth. I think it goes back to the hardening of the platform. That was one of the key decisions in terms of if we have to productionize this, we really need the platform to be hardened. So looking at, okay, how do you tokenize the data? How do you decide, okay, which data stays within the restricted area, which data is freely available for the data scientists to start doing their modeling around it? I think a lot of the decisioning went in around that space. Again, as Michael said, most of the technology here is proven. People have tried it, tested it. It was kind of putting Humpty Dumpty together and seeing that how everything works together in terms of the complementary nature of those technologies.
And just moving the data back and forth within the environments was relatively straightforward. Not easy, but relatively straightforward. But hardening for production, when you think about how you manage your AWS accounts, how you manage across VPCs, how you do disaster recovery and backup, the high availability and disaster recovery, working through availability zones and regions and structuring things so that you can actually run operations that hit the appropriate number of nines for your use cases, I think is where the real sort of engineering expertise comes in. Again, just moving files, moving data around is relatively straightforward, but organizing it for high-end enterprise production readiness is again, a big part of the lift of the transformation.
And I imagine scalability is a big piece too. You got lots of data sources. You have cyclical, a cyclical business sometimes. How did the platform cope with that?
Yeah, so it's an interesting environment, especially being in financial services where we have a lot of cycle-based processing.
Just had Black Friday, right?
Yeah, exactly. From a legacy perspective, I think it's significantly difficult to engineer for the ups and downs of cycles and things like Black Friday and Cyber Monday, et cetera. So when you look at the ability of the cloud to do things like autoscale and to manage varying workloads over time, and the ability to sort of shrink when you don't need it and to expand when you do need it, I think is a significant feature. But it's not a plug-and-play feature. And so you can go in a console and mark something as autoscale. That does not mean that your loads can autoscale and be production ready. Right? So really being able to take sophisticated engineering and expertise to it to create something that is production ready and scalable and robust enough to manage sort of your tens of millions of transactions a day, I think is again, where the art comes into the science.
And that scalability. And now what about the ability to make decisions faster? You're using this data in different ways now, hopefully, right? And being able to drive your business in different ways and faster. How does the platform enable that?
So there are a couple different aspects to that. I think one of them is, so if you believe the estimates of 3/4 of your model development time is on data wrangling, data munging, and just trying to understand what you have so you can start to create your algorithms. We'll sort of go back to why we spent so much time and so much focus on the data governance and metadata and lineage and really understanding the data. We want to create much more for-purpose data sets for our analysts and our model developers to consume, as opposed to what's a bit of a on-prem Wild West, where they have to take a lot of time trying to figure out what's the appropriate set of data and the appropriate data elements and features to use as part of that. So if you think from that perspective, we're really trying to shrink the amount of time that our model developers need to find the right data and then to create new models and then to get those models into production. So that's a big part of what we've tried to do from a process perspective. And then, the part of the journey that I think that we're really just sort of, cutting our teeth on is around how you consume your streaming data, your real-time data, beyond things. I mean, certainly we do transaction level fraud monitoring and that sort of thing now. But how do you start to consume different types of stream data to make differentiated decisions, to personalize, across your digital channels, your web channels, et cetera. Those are the types of things that I think we're heading into. But most of the focus, I think, has been to continue to manage and maintain our batch infrastructure.
Got it. And once you have those data sets, right, the way you want them and you have them all kind of trained, let's talk a little bit about, how the platform is helping you enable machine learning, data science, some of the more advanced data, features.
Yeah, certainly. So if we look back to our on-prem environment, so we have a very large SaaS grid. We have an ab initio grid. We had our data science platforms, H2O, is where most of our models are developed, our machine learning models. But on-prem, I think for us to be able to upgrade for our model developers to be able to use the newest tools, we'd have to upgrade an entire grid, which meant all the users would have to go at once. We'd have to procure new hardware. And so the part of the benefit of the cloud, and one of the things that we have another one of our engineering teams do, is we created a product called AIR9, which is our model, our machine learning and data science modeling platform, which containerizes some of our newer development environments, so we can turn around the ability to use a new version of R, a new version of H2O. It's integrated with all of the appropriate identity and access management tools to be able to make sure that the appropriate data is accessible through the process. And so we're really trying to scale across the entire life cycle of how the data is used. So we've built platforms for our data scientists to access their tools and the environments better. We've put in place new data catalog and new tools for us to be able to understand the data. But if you look at the data that we've run historically in our legacy environments, the data is historically has been, I'll call it, somewhat of an afterthought from a process perspective. And so as new projects get ready to go into production, they say, hey, we need to get this data into our data warehouse, which basically meant that as you're sort of hurrying to get that data into a consumable environment, the data warehouse ended up looking a lot like your transactional applications. It was pretty normalized and not very sort of fit for purpose from an analytical perspective. And so what we're doing now is as we move to the cloud and create these much more sophisticated tools and processes, we're actually shifting the analysis of the data left in our product life cycles so that we can create much more fit for purpose data sets. So we have much more highly curated data that our model developers and analysts can use. We let them access it with much more sophisticated tools. We let them discover that data through data catalogs that have much more highly curated metadata and lineage for that. So really creating an environment that makes their job easier. And again, I think those are some of the underrated aspects of the transformation that we've ended up spending a lot of time on, because ultimately that's what's going to promote usage.
That's the value.
I think the process of build it and they will come from a cloud perspective is a bit of a fallacy, at least from a Discover perspective. We really needed to create an environment that was alluring and adds value to them, not just that's where the data is, so that's where people will start to work.
I think that's a key point in terms of giving the data scientists easy access to the data and having that metadata available for the data scientists to actually understand, okay, which data to pull and what models will be most effective for that scenario. And the other thing was giving them options. I mean, it's not about everybody has to code on R or everybody has to code on Python. We even integrated I think the SaaS grid is also integrated with it, so people can actually go in and do their models in whatever technology they want, but leverage the data that is there on the cloud from the data lake, use it for training their model, and then pushing it into the API so that it can be used for decisioning.
So a much faster cycle.
Much faster cycle. And all of it has a CI/CD pipeline built under it, so it's actually automated from a move from the dev environment or the experiment environment into the actual production environment.
Okay.
With the right controls, of course.
Well, and again, it's a journey. Right? So from a product perspective, it's evolving, and as we've produced the environment that is useful for our data scientists and analysts, we're learning more and more about not only how they do their jobs, right? So just creating capability and data sufficiency on the cloud is not enough to really get
Sure.
substantial movement to our cloud environment. So really understanding how they do their jobs, how they will want to do their jobs in the future. Which things can you provide self-service? Which things need to get productionized through data operations teams? Those are the types of decisions that we're making on an ongoing basis that don't necessarily have a binary answer. Those things will be a bit of gray area as we move through the process. We just need to disposition them, make some decisions on them,
Right.
and move forward. But ultimately, I think that concept of control, of keeping your environments as clean as possible, nothing's going to be pristine, but keeping them as clean as possible in a new environment is really important to us.
Talking about gray area, one of the things that you and I have talked about many times is the whole concept of responsible AI, where the models make their own decisions in this new world. So how do you actually do it? I know at Discover you have been doing it with the traditional models, but as you moved some of the things to cloud, some of the models are still on the legacy. I know there were some challenges in terms of the results that were coming out, so you would talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so maybe I'd look at that in a couple different ways. One is really part of the process is making sure that your data scientists, that your risk managers, that your model governance teams really understand the data that's being used, and that they have as much visibility to that data to understand where there are opportunities for maybe some historical bias, to understand, are you feeding sort of the right breadth of data into your models to make sure that you're getting the appropriate answers out of them. So I think that's the area from a data and process perspective that we can influence and that we can control. I think the other part of it, that's a little bit of the secret sauce, a little bit of the magic that from our data science team, is creating some explainable or sort of self-explaining machine learning algorithms that open up the black box a bit. Because we have a lot of constraints around things like fair lending, and so we don't run credit decisions directly off of machine learning models without being able to show why that decision was
Right.
made and be able to sort of justify from a fair lending perspective.
Good. So it's evolving, right? So let's focus a little bit on what's kind of next for analytics at Discover. You started to talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, so most of what we've done so far and most of what we put in place is around our batch environment. The fact of the matter is most of our banking and financial services run in batch mode right now. But we are putting in place a number of the different tools and processes to be able to consume real-time events, to be able to be much quicker in decision-making as we go forward. And so we're building out a streaming data platform. We have an event bus that we can pull a lot of those events off of now. And then as we think about how do we create the art of the possible from a business perspective to really understand what they would do if they had streaming data, if they had that raw data available real time. I think that's the biggest hurdle to go through the process. Because ultimately, again, we can make the technology work. We have data that we manage through our event bus now. We, like I said, we manage tens of millions of transactions and validate fraud through them every day. And so the ability to consume that amount of data is not new to us. It's how do we want to use it, and then how do we create an environment that takes advantage of that sort of real-time decision making.
I think one of the questions I would ask you here is, everybody gets excited about real-time analytics and all of these nice things. I have seen a huge return on investment just doing the batch framework, what we started with, right? So what were your thoughts on that in terms of focusing on that as going in?
Sure. So the way that we approached the process was we knew that creating a new data environment was going to be a journey. It was something that was going to take in the double-digit month time frame. And so our data scientists created a number of new models, a number of machine learning models against our old data. And they've been cutting their teeth on how to do that really well as we've created some of these new data sets. And so the next part of the journey is, as we've created these more sophisticated, more highly curated data sets, putting those models, those machine learning models, onto that new set of data, I think is the next step in that maturation. We've put some of the more predictive algorithms, machine learning and AI types of models against things like managing credit, so credit line increases, credit decisioning, being able to get a much more sophisticated view of where our customers are in our collections process. So I think in the old world, we would look at someone that was pretty close to being delinquent or to charge off as higher risk by definition from a life cycle standpoint than someone that was earlier in the process. But as we start to put these algorithms and understand consumer patterns and understand more about behavior, we've had a much more realistic curve that some people that are sort of closer to delinquency aren't necessarily high risk, just that they pay later in the cycle. Some people that are still early in their cycle, given their attributes, are maybe a little bit higher risk. And so that comes into not only how do we manage our collections and recoveries process, but how do we think about fraud as well? Because especially in the credit business, the bad guys are really, really good, really, really sophisticated. And so we need every trick we can to understand where there are potential fraud happening as part of our portfolio.
So would you say that running your existing models on a more scalable cloud data platform helped you identify some of those areas and then also identify where new models can benefit in driving some of those business decisions?
Yeah, certainly, and that's what I mean by running the new models on old data and being able to ingest, because as the economic cycle continues to expand, I think it's as of July, it's the longest post-war expansion that we've had. So looking at through the cycle data means that now you're looking back 10, 12, 15 years of data. The ability to take all of that data into one place and run scenarios, run models, and store data as you go through that generates a lot of data. And so the ability to do that is really only something that we would have as part of being in the cloud. We wouldn't be able to continue to generate that much data on-prem without having to really significantly increase our on-prem infrastructure.
Great. So if you could summarize the last 12 months at Discover, that would be great, and maybe some advice for other people out here that may be just starting this journey.
Yeah, for sure. So I think as we look at how we think about new products, new controls, new processes, build with automation in mind. That's one of the benefits of the cloud, things like scalability and auto-scaling, and a lot of these processes are really geared towards automation. So build that in first and really think of that. And think about creating your architecture as modularly as possible. One of the things that we still have a multi-year journey to unwind is all the complexity of the intertwined processes and data that we have on-prem. And so really think about how do you create the right tools, create them as in a modular way as possible, as discoverable as possible, so that you can create as much optionality going forward as possible. The tools are evolving. Don't fall in love with your tools. That didn't sound right. Sorry. So these things will evolve. You want to take advantage of the tool sets that come out as much as possible. But the more you build vendor lock-in, the more you create tools that or processes that are specific and bound to your tools, the less optionality you create over time. And so again, just keep an open eye towards what processes and capabilities you're using, and is that going to lock you in beyond what's going to be sort of palatable. Productionize, think of your environment not as a sort of a monolith, but think of it as a set of interoperable products that let you optimize where you need to optimize and let you sort of create, which things can you just use as commodity types of products where they're not going to create an advantage for you. And then the one thing that will be an interesting balance, I think, as we go through the process, and I think it's probably similar for most folks, is we want to use this transformation as an opportunity to reset, but we also know that we're not going to be sort of academically perfect, and we're not going to have a pristine cloud environment. And so we want to keep it as clean as possible. We want to put as many good practices and processes as possible, but we also don't want to run in multiple production environments forever. And so there are some things we're going to compromise on. Just be careful as you make sort of declarations out to your stakeholders of things like, we will never do this, or we will always do that, because as time goes on and some things that were constraints become imperatives, they end up making compromises. And so I think just be open to that, and I think ultimately settling on which tools, which processes, which controls are right for you is how to manage that transition from legacy environments.
That's interesting. So looking at the future and being ready for the future, because things are changing all the time, right? It's basically how you boil it down. Arun, what would you add?
I think two things come to mind. One is being deliberate about the business value that you're trying to deliver through this. I think that was front and center in terms of the initiative that we were doing. Identifying that, okay, this is the business value that we want to drive. It's not a technology project where we are adopting cloud or adopting a particular technology. It was about what's the business value, what's the ROI that we are going to deliver. And the other was the multidisciplinary team that was stood up, looking at it right from technology to actual data engineers, but also the operations part of it. How would you scale it? How would you manage it in production? Thinking about it upfront, not as an afterthought, was very critical in success.
Right.
Yeah, and I guess the one thing that I would add as well is, and we talked about it a little bit before, but the transformation is not just a technology transformation. Ultimately, we can create the tools, the processes, give data sufficiency, and enable everything on the cloud. First of all, you need to make sure that your stakeholders and consumers, your end users, are using the tools on the cloud, but also that they're keeping an eye towards what does it take to get off of your legacy environment. So we can move all of our folks using new data sets on the cloud, but if they still have their the BI tool we use is Tableau. So if they're still using a number of Tableau reports that are running off of your legacy environments, then you sort of set yourself up for those that multi-operational environment. And so really thinking about how do you not only create new, but what does it take to be able to move off of a legacy environment? And so we could probably spend another hour talking through that process. That can become a bit of a rat's nest of process, but really, really important to understand what's there, how you pull it apart, and how you actually get migration, not just consumption of new in your new environment.
Great, good advice. We do have time for a few questions, but before that, I want to say thank you to Michael and to Arun for sharing the story today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
And if there are any questions out here, we do have a microphone floating at the back. Up at the front, we have one.
Hey, so a question on how you made that business transformation. What I've seen is a lot of legacy rule-based processes. You might have a clinician or an analyst who knows how to declare what fraud is, and over here we have data scientists that have figured it out using some really sweet machine learning models. How do you balance the friction, maybe the business politics, of going from human decision to machine learning?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that's one that would take a while. I think ultimately as I mentioned before, the hardest part of this process is the people, and without executive level mandates around this is what we're going to do and how we're going about doing it, it just won't be successful. And so the way we did it was we took one particular area where we had one of our executive committee members say, in my area, this is what we're going to do. All of the analysts, all of the model developers, everybody is going to move in this time frame. And so it really created that sense of urgency and galvanized moving over. The complexity isn't necessarily the things that are, let's call it visible. So we have an inventory of models, of course, as every financial services company would. So we know what needs to move there. As data sources move, we know those need to get redone. We also have hundreds, thousands of production business processes that run off of end user sandboxes. And so the decision comes in, can you retire them, which hopefully becomes a large number of those. Do you move them over directly, because that gets you off of your legacy environment, but that might compromise what your target state looks like, or do you take the time to define the metadata, to recreate those data sets in a production environment, which will take time and will consume resources not only from the technology side, but also from the business side as well. And so it's that business discipline, I think, that really becomes the pivot point, the key on how to move those. And those are the things I think, and which is why we spent so much time on it here, because again, the technology it's not easy, but it's straightforward and relatively known now how to do these things. But the fortitude and the business decision on moving, I think, is the real critical factor to it.
Thank you. Any other questions? In the front over here, and I'll get to you next.
Hi, good morning. So thanks, Chad, Arun, and Michael for the review. Pretty detailed. So I'm from Verizon. So question, from the describe, why AWS, right, as the chosen Mike. Second part is in terms of storage being your largest, I guess, spend. How do you really manage, your spend compared to, let's say, your on-prem storage infrastructure?
Yeah, so great question. So I'll repeat. I think what I heard was why AWS in the beginning, and then how do we manage costs, particularly storage costs. So why AWS? I think first of all, the market leader, I think, is pretty straightforward. I think parity is coming fast, for sure. But the breadth of services, the number of really sophisticated use cases that are running on the AWS environment were a lot of the reasons that we chose in the beginning. Now, like I said, I think we are keeping a bit of an open mind around a multi-cloud strategy. There may be some workloads and data sets that may make more sense on another cloud, depending on, we have a lot of software as solution partners that may run in Azure or in Google Cloud. And so we are open to those, but I think ultimately, that we're getting, we chose AWS for those reasons, and we're getting what we need. And so I think they've become a really important strategic partner for Discover. How we manage our costs, I think, is it's an evolution. I think right now we're still in the place where costs are going up, and we're trying to manage as efficiently as possible. If you think of that more as an art than a scientist, I wouldn't say that we're sophisticated artists at it yet. We are at the point where we're moving the data, we're creating more and more data sets, and sort of managing the costs as best we can, but we really haven't created a good mechanism to manage costs particularly efficiently. I think as we create these new, more highly curated data sets and we start to understand how to manage those better, I think we'll start to get better at it. But as you go into the journey, know that you're going to spend, your on-prem costs are probably going to continue to rise, or your on-prem storage needs are going to continue to rise, as will your cloud spend. First of all, until you learn how to manage the cloud really well, but secondly, until you actually learn how to migrate and take away use cases on-prem, which again is not necessarily just a factor of data sufficiency on the cloud, but can you actually move workloads and get people to stop using your on-prem environments. And so that is a big part of the journey that you have to be prepared for.
one more quick one over here, and then if there's other ones, we're about to time out. We'll be up here for a few minutes afterwards, and we're happy to chat as well.
Yeah, a question for me is, as you move towards fast data, the data decision making that you're doing presumably becomes more integral to kind of the operations of your business. Do you see that pushing you towards multi-cloud strategy? And equally, are you seeing the regulators pushing you down that road as well?
So I think the question was, given how we're managing data, regulatory pressures, et cetera, does that part of why we're thinking about a multi-cloud strategy, and is that?
Yeah, I guess, does that real-time decision-making make it more integral to the operations of the business and therefore more critical, and therefore you need resilience from multi-cloud?
I think from an operational perspective, from my perspective, I think it would be more simple, more straightforward to manage a less than multi-cloud strategy. I was a unicloud, I don't know. I think there are reasons around lock-in, there are reasons around how you optimize workloads that really drive the multi-cloud strategy. There's nothing regulatory or any sort of compliance-related pressures to do those. I think ultimately it's just a matter of can you create the optionality for the right tool for the right job? But from an operational perspective, less is more, and simpler is better. And I think that's sort of the mantra that we're going through as we sort of create our new environments.
I think in Europe there is something around having a multi-cloud partner. There are some regulations. We still don't have that in US, so that was not applicable in this scenario. But yes, if you are talking from a European context, that becomes important. Obviously, we do have the on-prem and cloud. So multi-platform management is still there. Yeah. It's not multi-cloud.
Yeah, I think the other part of it too is, while we have significant scale at Discover, we also don't have the scale of maybe some of the other sort of big banks that have been around for a very long time. And our ability to scale in those instances is significantly enhanced by, being able to leverage the cloud. I think that, if we didn't have those types of pressures, I think how you manage that transformation, the drivers become a bit different. So to your point, we run a lot of, in our net-to-net operations internationally. RBI, the Royal Bank of India, declared that all sort of data within Indian transactions have to stay within the country itself. And so making sure that there is you have partners that can satisfy that as you think about, I think Turkey's talked about doing something similar, Brazil's talked about doing something similar. So, at that point, then you may end up having, to make different decisions depending on availability of services.
Thank you again, guys, and thanks
Thank
everybody
you. Yeah,
for
thanks
coming.
everybody for showing up and for staying.
And we'll be up here for a couple more minutes.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.